Good afternoon, and we may be a small crowd, but if this is being filmed, hopefully it'll go out even further. I'm going to talk to you about the money and power that lies behind 9/11 and the wars that we've seen subsequently. You've probably heard about the rumours about put options on United Airlines and American Airlines, but that's only part of the story. There are much bigger sums of money involved, and I recently came across a film. Could you put the next slide up, please? Right, I came across this film recently by Barbara Honegger. She's the military affairs journalist for the Naval College, or was, and also a former advisor to the White House. She has a lot of inside information in terms of the way things work. And she's put together this 3-hour video, which in forensic detail is quite mind-blowing. I've looked mainly at the Twin Towers because there's a lot more information. But whatever you think you know about the Pentagon, unless you've seen this video, you don't really know what went on. And I would urge you to watch that film. And one of the pieces of the film is the $2.3 trillion that was missing from the Pentagon budget announced by Donald Rumsfeld the day before 9/11. And the office that was actually investigating this particular affair was the Office of Naval Intelligence, which actually is located approximately where the alleged aeroplane hit the building. Now, she also goes on to explain that there were explosive charges in the Pentagon, not just in that location, but in a couple of other locations as well. But certainly the Office of Naval Intelligence was targeted. Can we have the next slide? Thanks. This second video from wearechange.org I've also come across quite recently, and it corroborates a lot of what Honegger has actually unearthed. But it's looking much more at the money side of things, whereas she's looking primarily at the Pentagon. And the Office of Naval Intelligence also comes up in the 9/11 false flag conspiracy, because it starts with a story that in 1991, following the collapse of the Berlin Wall, George Bush Sr. and a few other people from the intelligence services and the banking world set up a covert black ops fund, and it was called Project Hammer, and it was valued at around $240 billion, and there were a bunch of government securities that were issued surreptitiously to actually fund this, and it was involved in the takeover of Russia and various other things. But the Office of Naval Responsibility was also investigating this particular affair. So I'm going to talk a bit about targets for 9/11, because I'm sure a lot of you who've looked into 9/11 know a lot about what went on, you know about the various aspects like the pods on the aeroplanes and all the other things. But I think it's worth concentrating on the targets and who was targeted and why. Now, the Office of Naval Intelligence is a fairly obvious one, but also there were these government securities. Now, the biggest 3 securities traders that were located in the World Trade Center were Eurobrokers, Cantor Fitzgerald, and Garban. All 3 of those were targeted, and we know they're targeted not only because that's where the planes hit and the explosions occurred, but also because those locations were reinforced or had extra fire retardant work done on them in the period leading up to 9/11. Now, what work was actually done, we shall never know. But certainly those floors which were targeted received very special mention. Also involved in being targeted was Marsh McLennan. And it wasn't just Marsh McLennan itself, but employees of Marsh McLennan who were asking questions about dubious transactions between Marsh McLennan and AIG. AIG owns Kroll Associates, which was in charge of security at the World Trade Center, and the boss of AIG is Maurice Greenberg. His son, Jeffrey Greenberg, was running Marsh McLennan at the time. There's also a software company involved called Silverstream, and if you Google on the name Richard Grove, he has some very interesting things to say about computer systems, fraud, not related directly to 9/11, but certainly how insiders are actually scamming the world by using faulty software deliberately with backdoors for people to get into. Now, you have to watch the film. It's packed with a lot of information, and there are a lot of names. And these names keep recurring. And they recur in organizations like Kroll, the Council on Foreign Relations, Project for the New American Century, Carlyle Group, Brookings Institute, the Trilateral Commission, and of course Bilderberg. And so there's a very murky world, and I haven't got time to go into any great detail, but I would urge you to watch the video. And of course the media have played their part, as we all know, in covering this up. And one of the facts that the film discloses, which I think we're probably most aware of, is that 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the US, and so it's fairly easy just to have the message given out by those in power. Could I have the next slide, please?
What's the name of the film, Clive?
The film is called 9/11 False Flag Conspiracy, and I think it's got a rider finally solved. But I would urge you to watch it, and the Honecker video is 3 hours, but well worth it. There's just so much information in there. Now, we've talked about money and fraud and securities trade, but actually the financial goal or the financial prize behind 9/11 and all these wars is much bigger than the 2.3 trillion or the 240 billion that I've just mentioned, or the put options that are referred to sometimes. We are talking about the banking system of the world. And this is in effect a class war. And the weapons of this class war are free trade agreements. Something that free trade agreements are negotiated in secret. People know very little about them. Even our elected representatives don't get to see the detail because they're negotiated by corporate individuals seconded to the process. And they are basically drafting laws for the benefit of bankers and elite interests. And once they're in place, they are irreversible, and they supersede any form of national sovereignty. And those are the weapons and levers that they use. And I want to talk particularly about the Financial Services Agreement, which the Financial Services Agreement is part of the World Trade Organization. And basically, I'm going to refer to a memo. And if you go and look on critical thinking and a particular story that I'm going to highlight in a minute, you can get the detail. But essentially, this memo was written by Tim Geithner, who was then working for Robert Rubin, an ex-Goldman Sachs banker running the Treasury in America, to his boss, Larry Summers. And basically, it was to encourage Summers to get all of the banking CEOs to bring pressure to bear to get this financial services agreement in place, which basically would mean that any country signed up to the World Trade Organization had to open up their banking system to the likes of Goldman Sachs and the people that control most of what goes on in the world. Could I have the next slide, please? This is the article. This is written by Ellen H. Brown. She's an attorney and she's a specialist in banking and various other things. She's written 14 books on the subject, and her site, Web of Debt, is well worth visiting, as is her book, Web of Debt, if you want to understand the banking system. And this particular article refers to the memo from Geithner to Larry Summers, encouraging Summers to get the banks to get this financial services trade agreement signed. But more importantly, she actually highlights who is actually targeted in terms of wars because of this memo. Essentially, countries which aren't signed up to the World Trade Organization are not participating in this banking scam that has taken over the rest of us. And therefore, they have been targeted. And this coincides with the same 7 countries the countries that I'm talking about: Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Sudan and Somalia. These 7 countries are the same countries that General Wesley Clark listed when he went into the Pentagon after 9/11, and a colleague told him that they had a list of targets which was those 7 countries. It is the money that drives this. It is, yes, it's resources and many other things, but it is banking interests which reign supreme over all of this. And as an aside, everybody feels, or I'm sure a lot of you know, that the Federal Reserve is not a government-owned institution, it's privately owned. Many central banks are privately owned. More importantly, the Bank of International Settlements, which is the central banker's central bank, is privately owned. And it has something called the Financial Stability Board, which actually imposes all these conditions on banking systems around the globe. If you'd like to know who chairs that particular board, it's our newly acquired Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. So I'm going to talk, I've taken a very brief trip across this, and if you want to understand it, you really have to go and watch the videos and read the article by Ellen Brown. But the point of bringing all this to your attention is to talk about power and how it is exercised. Because what we've been doing in the critical thinking course is trying to understand how the world works, how all these bits join together, how public service cuts, wars and banking and all these various things fit together. And essentially what we've come down to is that there is this nexus of power, which I'm sure is of no surprise to any of you. There was a study produced in the autumn of 2011, published in the New Scientist, and they analysed 43,060 transnational corporations and looked at public records, the directors and the shareholders. And their analysis came down to 147 what they described super entities that controlled 40% of that network. Now, if you controlled 40% of world trade, effectively you control the world. And in the top 20 were all the usual banks, JP Morgan Chase, Goldman Sachs, Barclays, etc. And of the top 50, 45 were financial companies. And so basically the world is run by banks. Now, an illustration of this, there was a very little known report brought out by Citibank. These banks produce reports for their investors to get them to invest money. And they coined the term in a report they pulled out, a series of reports in fact, 3 of them, around 2005-06, where they coined the term Plutonomy. Now, when you look at economic figures and people talk about averages, they're talking about averages including the very poorest and the very richest. What Citibank was saying was, the very poorest no longer matter. Probably the middle don't really matter, because what really drives economic activity is the Plutonomy. In other words, it's the luxury goods. It's the LVMH brands. It's the Rolls Royces. It's the BMWs. Or the high-end BMWs, not the low-end BMWs. But it's all those things you've seen down Bond Street and Knightsbridge. That is the shopping territory of the Plutonomy. And basically what the Citibank report was saying was, the world is run for these people, everybody else doesn't matter. Now, their lawyers have actually tried to suppress people putting this up on the website. I've put it up on Critical Thinking and nobody's approached me yet, but they tried to suppress the fact that they'd let the cat out of the bag. So what we're left with is a shrinking middle class and a precariat. And the precariat is basically all those people who are living at the margins, who are basically living a very precarious existence. And that precariat is expanding. So, if you can go to the last slide, I think it is. So what we've been doing is analysing, and what we've come down to is that there are 3 fundamental flaws within our economic system. And I'm not going to go into any depth on those at the moment. But one of those relates to banks' ability to create money from nothing as debt. And that is all premised on the concept of interest. And fundamentally, interest is driving most of the problems in the world. It's driving unsustainable extraction of resources, production, waste, and all the other things. It systemically drives inequality. It is the source of many of our problems. And therefore, we need to, and the power over what's happening and the resistance to change, because of control of the media, control of governments, control of everything that dominates our lives, is held by people who have a vested interest in banking and the maintenance of the idea that money should earn interest. Now, I would urge you to go and look at this video, which is called Economics to Save Our Civilization, which was a presentation I did to the Securities Institute in the City of London. I work inside the beast of the devil, and I sup with a very long spoon, but I would urge you to go and look at that video, because actually there I lay out the flaws which are fundamental, and they've been around for years. 9/11 wasn't the product of something that happened over the last 30 years. It's a product of the system that's evolved through centuries, by bankers, for bankers, and landowners. And finally, I'd like to tell you a little story that I heard last night, actually. I don't know how many of you have heard of Michael Ruppert. He's ex-LAPD, and he's done a lot of investigation into the financial transactions around 9/11, as well as trying to blow the cover on CIA drug trading for 20 years or more. He's been trying to get that into the public sphere, and has suffered considerable attack, both physically, mentally, and psychologically, as a result. But he told this story that I heard last night, which is basically the US were conducting nuclear tests, exploding atom bombs on a remote island. And clearly it was uninhabitable. But some years later they thought we ought to try and see if we can repopulate the island. So they put a bunch of monkeys on there to see how they would fare. And after a while they went back to check on the monkeys, and everything seemed okay, except coconuts, which were the staple diet of the monkeys, seemed to have some residual radiation on the shells. And so they took one monkey and they trained this monkey to wash the coconut in cold water. And it took about 4 weeks, but eventually the monkey got the idea, and they let the monkey back into his community, and he continued to wash his coconut. And little by little, another monkey washed his coconut, and then a couple more, and very soon a dozen had washed their coconut. And the numbers crept up and up until it got to 100. And then magically the whole population of 10,000 started washing their coconuts. So Michael Ruppert and I, and us, are looking for that 100th monkey. So if you know how to get to those 100 monkeys, get out there and talk to them about this stuff. Thank you very much.